So what's up, my friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how to paint Ulik from Marvel Crisis Protocol. I've got the colors I used on this model up on the screen, so if you want to give the video a pause, copy those down, and then we can dive right on into the video tutorial. In terms of building and prepping the miniature, this was actually sent to me by the client. So the actual figure itself was assembled by him. I did a bit of correction and gap filling mainly on the sides of his underpants, clean up some mold lines, and then thankfully he has kept the base and the actual model separate. That's what I would do for my own model as well, largely because of the way that he sits on it. There's a lot of overlap in terms of his body to the base, and I feel like keeping them separate lets you paint both separately. You can do a bit of airbrushing, whatever you need to do. It makes it a lot easier in particular to paint detailing on the base when you have the model not glued on. So for larger bases like this, I highly recommend keeping, where possible, the model and the base separate. If you want to find out how I painted this base, I'll have a video tutorial in the video description below. I'm not going to do any of the weathering or maybe some posters or newspapers yet. What I want to do is make sure that I glue the model on first, which means painting it. And then when I do the weathering powders and the final touches, I can do both the base and the model simultaneously. I'm going to start with an airbrush base coat of very dark brown. Because I use a lot of earthy, warm brown tones on this model, I wanted to apply this with the airbrush just to speed up the process a little bit. From there, I'll apply a base coat with AK's medium rust. I'm doing this again with the airbrush to speed up the process. The skin forms a major part of the model, and doing it with the airbrush instead of by hand just gives a cleaner finish much faster. From there, I'll do a 50-50 mix of orange, brown, and medium rust, and I'll do a soft zenithal highlight on the skin. This is just to give myself a nice mid-tone to highlight off of, and without having to spend all the time building up to that orange-brown tone. Once I'm done with the airbrushing, I'll go back in with pure orange-brown, and I'll start to block in the various muscle shapes. The important part of this step is to make sure that you are applying a nice clean base coat. So do a couple of layers, a few passes. You also want to make sure that you're connecting the different muscle groups to help to connect everything and make it feel like one form as opposed to individual chunks or ovoid shapes. From orange-brown, I'll start mixing progressive amounts of sunny skin tone. You can see that I'm going fairly high contrast with this, and I'm looking to basically block in the various highlight shapes because I'll be going back in with the airbrush to do some glazing and some smoothing of the blends. So the more high contrast I can do this stage first, the better the end result will be. This technique works very well with larger models like this where the features and the muscular shapes are very clearly defined, and it allows you to use the airbrush to do a lot more smoothing. I find that if the model is smaller or the effects are more subtle, you'll want to do a few more transition steps, do a bit more of that blending by hand, so that when you go back in with the airbrush to do the glazing, it's a lot less work. You don't need to worry about overspray or doing the glazes by hand for greater accuracy. So here you can see I'm going back in with some of my orange-brown. I've got the mixture diluted to almost a watercolor consistency. So I would say probably 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint. And then I'm very gently underspraying this glaze onto the model. By building up very thin progressive layers of color, I'm effectively glazing with the airbrush. Again, you can do this by hand. There's pros and cons to both. The airbrush, I find you can get a more consistent finish over a larger area, especially if you're underspraying to catch the various shadowed parts of the model, but you do lose a bit on accuracy and you end up with a bit more overspray, whereas by hand, you get more accuracy, but you need more technique and brush control to be able to get a smoother, more consistent finish. I do the same thing with the medium rust, again, catching the undertones. I'm looking to deepen it back into that mid-dark orange-brown tone. And this is really where that high contrast highlighting pays off. You can see that as I'm laying out these progressive layers of airbrush glazes, it smooths all those layers together, and you effectively end up with a much smoother blend for not as much work. paint the eyes and the mouth, I'm going to start with a base coat of Tenebris Gray. I'm going to paint in the eye sockets as well as the mouth. And then from there, I'll use white sands to paint the white of the eye, as well as each of the individual teeth. For the teeth, I recommend diluting your paint a bit and doing a couple of progressive layers so that it's not the same intensity of white all the way through, but you can do a bit of a highlighted effect on the front. To paint the fur, I'm going to start with a base coat of dark shadow. You'll want to make sure that you keep a nice clean edge where the hair blends into the various parts of the skin. From there, I'll highlight up with medium rust. This is a soft value step up, and my goal with this is to transition a bit into the deepest shadows of the skin. Because we used medium rust as part of the skin base tone, this will help just to naturally blend the hair in, especially on a model like this where the hair transitions are a bit more subtle in spots. From there, I'll start mixing in progressive amounts of beige red into the medium rust. The degree to which I highlight this will really depend on the position of the hair and how much light is receiving it versus how much I want to pop certain elements. So you can see here on the top of the forearm, I'm really focusing on these strands near the top, where as it pulls to the bottom, I apply fewer and fewer highlights to pull it back into the shadow tone. To paint the non-monometal, I'm going to start with a base coat of IDF Modern Gray. This is going to end up being a fairly warm brown tone non-monometal silver. I think ultimately the colors don't matter. It's more just about placement of light and shadow and making sure that your color progression makes sense. My next highlight is with this Dunkelgelb Ausgabe, and particularly on the front plate, you can see that I'm not really focusing on smoothing out the transitions. I'm more blocking in these bands of highlights to get a strong contrast between my shadow bands and my highlight band. And I just continue highlighting this up. As I build my layers up, the colors get more and more translucent out of the bottle. And so even with minimal dilution, you are able to start to layer and build up those highlights. And as you work those highlights up, the transitions do naturally become smoother. From warm gray into pale sand especially, you'll want to mix up a few transition steps, dilute the color. The further along you get to white, the greater the risk that your paint can become chunky because of the way that the pigments interact with dilution and with water. So you'll want to make sure that you are not over diluting or under diluting, and you're building up your layers progressively to get a nice smooth finish. It's also at the stage that I'm starting to focus on the left and right sides of the chainmail armor. I have my highlights focused in from where Ulik is facing, so on the model's left-hand side. So you can see that on the chainmail, all of one side is getting a stronger highlight, where I'm keeping the opposite side more in shadow. Again, non-monometal, to sell that shiny, reflective material, you need that bright and dark contrast. So working up from that warm gray into pale sand and ultimately up into pure white. With the pure white, I do recommend not going overboard. I'm focusing this highlight mainly on the sharpest edges. I'll pick out a few bands, particularly on the front plate, just to get a little bit of extra contrast. And I also go back in on a lot of the corners, and I add a pure white dot for a bit of extra sparkle. Using some Tenebris Gray, I'm going to apply a base coat onto his shorts, his bands, as well as the trim on his vest and chainmail. You want to be careful with this to not overpaint onto any of the skin or the armor, so just be careful when you're painting the edge. From there, I'll apply a base coat of dark sea blue. Again, just covering all of the shorts and the bands, leaving that Tenebris Gray to help black line the different elements. To highlight the shorts, I'll be using anthracite gray, and the technique is very similar to how we paint the skin. Broad highlights, less focused on transitions because I'll be using glazes afterwards to smooth out those blends. I continue to highlight by mixing in progressive amounts of pale blue. How bright or how dark you want to take these highlights is entirely up to you. I do go a little bit heavier, especially on the front, because I want to have a fairly high contrast, a really bright gray-blue tone. I think it complements well with the orange of the skin. And again, that high contrast allows me to push those blends a little bit more, especially in that glaze state. So you can see here that I'm not really smoothing out those blends. I'm just blocking out these chunky highlights, picking out all the different forms and folds of the material. For the glaze, I'll use anthracite gray and dark sea blue first as a 50-50, and then I'll mix more and more of the dark sea blue until my glaze is just pure dark sea blue. And I'm just basically building up the layers. For this, I'm doing this by hand instead of the airbrush for accuracy. I don't want to overspray the blue onto any of the orange elements, and it's just about building up those layers to get a smooth blend. To paint the straps, I'm using dark sea green. Apply a base coat, leaving the edges as well as the inset band in the middle in that dark sea blue base coat. I'll highlight this with deep green. And you can see here that I've also chosen to do the green straps first before going in to paint the ovoid baubles in the same recipe as the non-metal silver. This just allows me to be a little bit messier with the green blend and not have to worry about painting around the non-metal baubles. My final highlight would be light green, and I'll be concentrating this on the front portions of the straps, particularly on the tops of the shoulders and the chest. As it curves down to the front and then particularly into the back, I'll let it sit in that dark green, deep green mix. And then finally, I'll finish off with a glaze of Gucci shade. Once again, using the airbrush, I haven't really diluted this. This is just the pure paint with a bit of flow improver. Despite how dark it looks in the bottle, this paint is fairly translucent, especially when you airbrush it. And so I'm just targeting all of the shadow tones to help unify everything and create a consistent environmental shadow to tie everything together. Once the model is done, I'll glue it to the base. I'll apply some weathering powders. Again, the full recipe for the base I'll have in a link in the description below. And that finishes our Ulik. So I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you enjoyed it, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.